Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here today. It's my pleasure to introduce William Howell. Will is the inaugural Dean of the School of Government and Policy at Johns Hopkins University, where he is also a professor of political science. His expertise is in the separation of powers among U.S. political institutions with a focus on the presidency. Among other other publications, he's the co-author of Presidents, Populism and the Crisis of Democracy, and Relic, How the Constitution Undermines Effective Government and Why We Need a More Powerful Presidency, as well as numerous other books and articles on American politics. He earned his PhD at Stanford University and was on the faculty at the University of Chicago for many years. Please join me in welcoming Will.
I'm going to do this without a net. This is going to be old school, and it's just going to be me and the ideas I want to share with you. When putting together my thoughts, or at least my initial commitment to come here, and thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be back. This was my first job was here at the University of Wisconsin, and I wrote a book about 25 years ago on the politics of unilateral action. And wrote most recently a book called Trajectory of Power, The Rise of a Strongman Presidency. And that's a book that thinks a lot about the administrative state and the relationship between the administrative state and trajectories of presidential power. And I thought I would, in my comments, reflect on the administrative state and what's playing out there. And then I saw that Don Moynihan was going to be talking about the administrative state, and I thought there's nobody better in the country to talk about the administrative state than Don Moynihan, and I better get out of the business of talking about that and switch up. And so what I want to do is instead reflect on these unilateral powers that are being exercised with abandon and to try to make sense of them. Barry, in your opening comments, you said that there was a chaotic whirlwind, I think is the language that you use. There's a real flurry of them. This is what we're seeing right now, is again and again, all kinds of unilateral directives being handed down by the president. And they're leading to profound policy change, disruption, a reconstitution of the state. And it's really hard amidst all this to get some perspective on this. But I'm going to try and offer some ideas about how we might understand the significance of what's playing out, how these politics that are playing out now align with long-standing trends in the politics of unilateral action. Not everything that's happening right now is new. And I want to try to be clear about some ways in which I think that the politics of unilateral action that we're observing right now reflect long-standing trends in presidential uses of these particular powers. But there are a couple of really important distinctions, to my mind, that have come into view. And I want to, having recognized some areas of continuity, then try to be as clear as I can about points of disjuncture, what they are, how specifically they break from past practice, and I'm going to try to sketch out a little bit of an explanation in each instance about what I think is going on, as best I can tell, recognizing fully that, I mean, I know my future self a few months from now is going to say, I got a bunch of things wrong, and yet here I am, we're going to try, right, to be as clear as we can be in this fraught moment. Okay, so let's start with continuities. Like, what's sort of, if not the same, at least a continuation of past practice? The first thing to note is that Trump did not devise these powers all into himself. They've been around for a long time, and there's a long-standing project of presidential power that involves the construction of new ways of exercising power outside of the legislative process. So these are powers that are being deployed not in the service of advancing a legislative agenda. They are about issuing executive orders or national security directives or memoranda or proclamations, issuing them, and then having them assume the weight of law upon their issuance. And it's the only way you overturn them is by action that's taken after the fact by Congress or the courts. And presidents have been doing this for a long time, and they've been doing it to considerable effect. So to say that, well, what's happening now is there is, Barry pointed out, he's doing a lot more of this. That's true. But boy, you can pull up a lot of examples of past presidents doing really remarkable things unilaterally outside of a legislative process and doing things that would not survive legislative scrutiny, that would not pass through Congress. And so a lot of the game in thinking about these powers and the significance of these powers is trying to think about how they affect policy in ways that realize change that couldn't be accomplished through Congress. And the short answer on there is there's a lot of action there. There has been for a long time. This is not something new. They do it. And the next thing to note that's a sort of point of continuity is that routinely presidents who step into office, who are replacing a president of the opposite party, act unilaterally to undo a whole lot of the unilateral actions issued by and policy agenda advanced by their predecessor, which is an important reason why these kinds of politics lead to a much more volatile policy domain than do the politics associated with lawmaking. Because you don't see instantly all the laws passed by the last Congress overturned by the next just because there's a change in majority. But you do see a lot of reconsideration. It's not seamless. There are some really interesting tensions that get in the way of one president just being able to unilaterally undo everything their predecessor has done. But boy, there's a lot of volatility there. And so the fact that Trump is undoing a lot of Biden, well, Biden undid a lot of Trump, and Trump undid a lot of Obama, and Obama undid a lot of Bush, and so on. These are our politics. These politics remain, moreover, a third point of continuity, remain at their core about what presidents can get away with, not who they can bring along. These are the politics not of coalition formation, not of building broad-based support in the service of taking action that a president couldn't take on his or her own. These are politics that are really about make my day, right? I'm gonna do something, and are you gonna amend or overturn what I've done? And if the answer is you're gonna have a hard time amending or overturning that which I've done, then I've won, right? Because again, a unilateral directive that a president issues retains the weight of law until and unless an adjoining branch of government amends or overturns it. These are about what I can get away with, right? And if I look over and I see, this thing that I'm taking is, this action I'm taking is probably illegal, but the courts, for a host of political reasons, aren't going to step in. Well, then I can push forward and I can simply issue that thing, and it's going to have real policy import going forward. And those are, again, a different kind of politics than the kinds of politics that we imagine and we occasionally see in the service of more constructive coalition building in the service of legislative action. Fourth, legislative gridlock routinely operates as a backdrop to unilateral action. So one thing that we're seeing right now is if you don't like Trump, you're pulling your hair out because you're saying, come on, Congress, do something about all these unilateral directives. And if you do like Trump, you're saying, Congress, you're doing the right thing, you're standing by. And if you are going to take action, I want to see you then instantiate those unilateral directives into law. Neither of those things are happening. And what we see routinely is that's precisely when presidents exercise these powers. In those moments when presidents enjoy huge levels of support within Congress, all the incentives line up behind the idea of, well, then introduce your legislation, your policy proposals as legislation to Congress. Pursue the legislative route if you have widespread support in Congress. And the machinery of government, the legislative machinery of government, stands a chance of actually coming to life, right? In those instances where you have widespread opposition within Congress, well, then you don't stand a chance of actually advancing your legislative agenda. That's true. So you might think, well, go exercise unilateral powers. That's not quite right, because precisely because you have huge majorities within Congress that oppose you, any action you take unilaterally is likely to be subsequently overturned. And so it's in those places in between. It's when Congress can't either advance an action that the president would like to see enacted into law, or equivalently can't get its act together to amend or overturn an action that the president takes unilaterally, is when presidents step forward. And so, like, to my mind, it's no great surprise that in this moment of legislative division, gridlock, and dysfunction, that we're seeing a president exercise these powers as much and with such consequence as they are. Continuity, 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 continuity. It's not all about a story about continuity, though. And I want to highlight two things that have led me to reconsider a book that I wrote that came out here. And I'm looking out at Ken Mayer because he wrote a book about unilateral action at the same time. And I remember as a graduate student thinking, wait, I'm on to something here. Nobody's talking about unilateral action. And Ken wrote the book right before me. And I thought, oh my God, what are we going to do? Right? So how do we then think about what might be different from the stories that we were telling, that people have tried to unpack and trying to make sense of how these politics are defined and the limits to these unilateral actions that presidents exercise? There are two breaks. The usual story, when I think when much of the field thinks about how presidents exercise these powers, goes roughly as follows. Presidents are expected to do way more than they can accomplish if you just look at their formal Article II powers. They're expected to attend to every conceivable problem out in the universe. They're put politically in an impossible position. All presidents are, right? And their ability to veto legislation or to issue public appeals or their commander-in-chief powers, whatever that might afford, is wholly insufficient when you think about their ability to meet the crush, the avalanche of expectations put before them. And so they have, over the course of the last century, constructed all kinds of ways to work around limits. They've built up an arsenal of powers that allow them to push outwards on the boundaries of their powers and lay claim to a measure of influence that isn't plainly or easily read into a narrow reading of Article II. This has been the project of the modern American presidencies, to build out their power, but that they do so in ways that are really calibrated and careful. What they do at every turn is they think, how far can I go? How much can I get away with? Recognizing that while I want to do an end run around Congress, Congress has an opportunity subsequently ex post to undermine that which I just did. The courts have an opportunity ex post to step in and say, no, you don't, and overturn the action that I took. And so what you then see is all presidents having an interest in expanding out the boundaries of their power, Democrat or Republican alike, but them behaving in ways that are strategic and calibrated. And sometimes they overreach and they go too far. But what they're trying to do, recognizing that where that boundary is about what they can get away with and what they can't get away with isn't well defined, is get right up to the edge as best they can, right? They want to get as close as they can without being overturned. Why do you not want to be overturned? Well, there are at least two reasons. One is there's a policy setback, right? The thing that you were trying to accomplish is then subsequently undone by the courts, by Congress, loss. And the other kind of loss is the headline that follows the court case that says, dear Truman, you can't overtake the steel mills unilaterally. And there's a notion that there's a political cost associated with the judicial rebuke. Or if Congress steps in and legislatively overturns an action that a president takes through an executive order, there's a political cost associated with that. So you push outwards, but in ways that are calibrated. That's the standard story. That's how I've been thinking about presidential power for a long time. That's not what we're observing right now, right? We're observing a president who's lobbying claims that vastly exceed conventional notions of where that line might rest. And doing so indiscriminately, asserting claims that obviously patently defy the plain reading of the Constitution. Promising unilaterally to end birthright citizenship. Like, are you kidding me? Like the president would have the power of that? Or that they can run for a third term for office, and on, right? There are all these these big claims. And what are we then seeing? A whole lot of rebukes, particularly from the judiciary, right? Like, this does not accord with the standard politics of unilateral action. Big, broad claims that vastly exceed fair-minded readings. And I don't mean fair-minded readings about what's true. I mean fair-minded readings about what you could actually hope to get away with. Nonetheless saying, well, we're going to go 10 steps further. And we're just going to say it. We're going to do it. We're going to issue the order that. So what's going on here? And then we have all these courts stepping in and overturning. So how do we make sense of this? That strikes me as a big break. The first thing that one is tempted to say is, well, this is just the politics of incompetence and inexperience and chaos. And it's just somebody who's firing off because they don't know better, or that they lack the temperament to do so. And I'm inclined to resist those sorts of explanations. They have a certain kind of merit, but I want to suggest sort of a sketch of an alternative that we might sort of consider collectively. And that has to do with the politics of populism. The politics of populism are centrally about a deep critique articulated by a political outsider of a political order that seemed to be corrupt to its core, broken to its core. That all the way through the traditional parties, the Congress, the courts, the media, everything is corroded. And what the populace does, the move that the populists make, is that this political order, dear public, has served you poorly. It has not just neglected you, it's looked upon you with disgust and scorn. And I see it for what it is, and I stand with you. And the project in turn is to at once then blow on the embers of your anger and your disaffection, one, that's part of what populist politics are about, but also to then undertake the work of pushing back on and laying waste to the very political institutions that you've said were broken. Like, the populist project is not a constructive project. It's a project in opposition to. And so when Don was talking about this is about breaking the administrative state, not redirecting it, not reconstituting it, that in important ways is what populist politics are generally about, I would suggest. So then let's go back to what's going on here. A president who then makes claims that vastly exceed what a fair-minded reading of what their powers are and what they could hope to get away with. Why do that? Why do that? Well, I think there's two things that might flow from it. One is that every once in a while you'll make that big claim and it'll stick. You'll actually be affirmed. And then you'll be the dog that caught that car. And to my mind, that's what happened last summer with the immunity ruling. There were these incredible claims being articulated about how presidents are immune from any kind of prosecution, and it was affirmed. And then that's a huge win for the project of expanding presidential power in ways that suit the political interests of a populace. It's like, you got the win, one. What happens, though, when you are rebuked? It's not clear to me that that's an obvious loss, though, for a populist, in at least two ways. The first is that when you're overturned, it becomes further grist for the mill and serves to authenticate you as a genuine outsider in a fight against a corrupt political order, right? This is not a mark against Trump when he loses. He doesn't suffer from his base when he's overturned by the courts. In many ways, he's seen as the true champion that he is, which is somebody who's willing to fight and push a set of arguments as far as they'll go. Moreover, what then can follow is the work not just of recognizing the limits of the adjoining branches of government, but a campaign that's meant to degrade the adjoining branches of government. And so presidents can then say things like, here is this court that's privileging the supposed due process rights of illegal gangbangers over the welfare of average Americans. Like that's what's going on right now, right? That kind of rhetoric can follow a judicial rebuke, or the kind of rhetoric that says, President, you can't do what you're doing with regard to higher education. The president can turn around and say, well, this is just a court that's interested in attending to Marxist elitists in academic cathedrals like the one that we're sitting in the protective confines of right now, instead of standing up for honest, hardworking Americans. And that's the work of delegitimation. It's the work of pushing back, a political project of pushing back on the judiciary, which is consistent with the aims of a populist. One disjuncture. Second disjuncture. So here's how I've been thinking about the relationship between public power and policy. For the most part, I mean, I wrote a book called what was it called? Thinking about presidential leadership, thinking about leadership. I don't remember what it was called, but it was a long essay trying to get a reflection on the president's relationship to power. And this was a story that I told that was not about presidents having an appetite for power. This is not about like presidents just enjoy it, right? It's that power matters to presidents for instrumental reasons. They need power in order to be able to do things. What they really want to do is build legacies of accomplishment. That's the challenge at hand. And to attend to, again, the crush of public expectations put before them. And so they're trying to lay claim to power, not because that they care about it per se, they care about it only insofar as they need it in order to be able to take subsequent action. And I don't know if that adequately characterizes present political moment, where we want to think about power just in instrumental terms, the value of power to presidents just in instrumental terms. And the way I've been thinking about it the last couple of months is that we might think about policy domains, policy fights that are playing out in very real ways as staging grounds for efforts to claim new power and disrupt existing power structures. The fight isn't centrally about the thing that we're talking about. What sits right behind the fight is a set of claims about how far presidents can reach, how much they can do, and where do other political institutions sit in relationship to the president. Think about right now the fight by the president with regard to higher education. Now, there's a story to be told, and there's merit to the concerns about DEI and anti-Semitism. And so I don't want to just completely flip it around. Like there's content to those arguments and those sorts of fights. But I also want to suggest that those are, in some important ways, foils for an effort to bring universities to their knees, and an effort to alter and disrupt in profound and deep ways the relationship between universities and not just the federal government generally, but the wishes of a president in particular. I think you could say much the same thing as it relates to tariffs. Like, there's an argument. Most of the arguments are bad, economic arguments for why we would want to massively increase tariffs across the globe. But notice the big thing that tariffs do is that they change the structure of the relationship between not just the president and a domestic political order, but how the president relates to foreign countries. And so all the action now is, how is each country one at a time going to come before the president in order to renegotiate what the terms of their relationship is going to be? And that kind of work, which you can understand as a project apart from what the economic consequences of the policy change, which is the introduction of widespread tariffs, that is the subject, that's the stuff of reconstituting, again, the presidency itself, which then gets me to think, should we be thinking about power just in instrumental terms, or we might think about, no, some policy domains are valuable precisely because they provide, I mean, the language I used earlier is let's think about them as sort of staging grounds for renegotiations of what presidents can do and where people sit in relationship to it. Why? Like, what is going on here? And again, here I'll say, to my mind, it has much to do with the politics of populism. And we haven't, to my mind, in today, in us talking about what's going on in this moment, said enough about populism. So I want to sort of breathe that into the conversation that we have. The objectives of a populist is not merely to advance policy within an existing system of governance, but an effort to reconstitute the order itself. So why do they do that? Why do people put up with it? There are a number of answers that one might point to why people would go along with it. There surely are some people who look at this project that Trump is undertaking and saying, I'm willing to go along with it because I fear political retribution or I'm hoping for political favor. That's part of it. There are some people, I think, who have a positive policy agenda that they have in mind, that they can see their ability to advance through a vastly empowered presidency, and so they're holding out for it. But the populist himself, herself, it's almost always a himself, their project is about, again, not just brandishing their credentials as an outsider, but to come forward and to say, as was said earlier, I alone can fix it, which is not just a brag, right? It's not, it's a project. It's a thing that one works at. It's the premise of the argument is I alone can fix it because everything is broken. And the work that I do, the project of populism in important ways, is to realize a political order in which it is true I alone can deliver. Because you undertake the work of degrading the adjoining branches of government. You reduce the capacity of the administrative state. You render the legislative process ineffective. There's not an effort to enliven, reconstitute, rebuild these adjoining places of power. Having issued your critique about how everything is broken, it's to further marginalize and delegitimate and break. And to leave yourself, the president, alone as the sole person who can undertake that kind of action. So that's a very different kind of logic. And it's a logic born of populism, which has been around in American politics for a long time, breaking into the White House for the first time in American history and being unleashed. And to my mind, that's what we're seeing. I'll stop there.
Great. So we're going to move into a question period just like before. If you have questions you want to ask, please add them to the form. You can either use the QR code to access the form, or the form is accessible at go.wisc.edu/Trump100. So feel free to submit your questions. I was so thrilled to see that you decided to talk about unilateral action. I mean, as the former scholar of unilateral action, this is like the perfect person for us to hear from today. I teach a class on Congress this semester, and so we talked in our week about Congress and the presidency. We talked about unilateral action, and we sort of tried to talk about like what was different about the Trump presidency. And so it's really interesting to hear sort of how you're characterizing this disjuncture of what is similar and what is different, because I think it's so easy in trying to describe the patterns of unilateral action over time to make it seem like an inevitable trajectory while still knowing things are very different this time. And so this conversation about what and why is just a really exciting place to go. I've got several questions in here from students, one of which is, you're trying to understand more about sort of unilateral action and why presidents would engage in it. So we have a question here, sort of talking about how we saw Biden attempt to pass his major policy platforms in Congress with the IRA, which will take forever to implement and came with intense in-party struggle. Why would a president attempt to legislate via Congress if he can just do things via executive action? Like, what are the sort of like beginning of this? Yeah.
Yeah, why not just give up with Congress entirely? I think that's effectively what Trump has done right now. But all else equal, presidents pre-Trump, I'm going to say, Democrat and Republican alike, all else equal, would prefer to have their policy initiatives written into law, if for no other reason, because they're more likely to endure. It's harder to overturn them. So that volatility I was describing is in no small part born of the fact that an executive order issued by one president can be overturned by an executive order issued by a subsequent president. Less clear, I mean, I think it was a hard and fast rule when we wrote our books, a hard and fast rule that you couldn't overturn a law with an executive order. That is a little bit of, I put a question mark by that now. But it certainly is the case that laws are more likely to endure. And for that reason alone, you would want them at the margin. But the answer, but presidents routinely can't pass their policy agendas legislatively. And yet there are all those expectations before them. And so what's not available to them politically is the option of saying, oh, what am I to do? It's Congress's job to pass the laws. And they're not doing their jobs, and so you should vote them out. Like, no, everything points to no, presidents, you've got to deliver. You have to deliver for us. Constitutional limits notwithstanding. Find a way to deliver, and unilateral powers are one way in which they do so.
So we have a question from a student, Ida N, who wants to know sort of whether you think President Trump is making large claims to executive power in part because he knows most of Congress is sympathetic to his cause and less likely to push back. And if so, if the Democrats regain control of one or both chambers of Congress in 2026, do you think his claims will become more or less conventional in comparison to past presidents?
Will Trump be brought to heel as a result of the midterm elections? As it relates to the claims he makes about executive power, I suspect the answer is decidedly no. His, again, is a project of executive aggrandizement. All presidents want more power, but boy, you supercharge those kinds of sentiments and dispositions when you enter into the politics of populism. And again, I think I'd linger on the point that rebukes to the populace don't have the same kind of political cost that rebukes to what I would call sort of normal presidents, no matter where you sit on the political spectrum. Because again, the populace is in the game of delegitimizing, not just critiquing, but delegitimizing a political order. And when they are rebuked, that affords them an opportunity to say, can you believe the bozos over there who are standing up for something that would seem to run afoul of traditional American values or the interest of their core constituents, or would be racialized in one way or another, or any number of political critiques that might follow, which can serve to brandish not just their brand, but to fortify their base, the strength and the support that they find within their base. And so I don't see it having the political cost associated with a loss in Congress or the courts that we're used to thinking, at least I was used to thinking about presidents trying to avoid applying. Not when we come to populism.
So we have a question from another student, Jack S., who said that you spoke about how many presidents are interested in legacy building. Do you believe that is what Trump's end goal is through his unilateral actions?
For sure, right? for sure Trump cares about his legacy. Like, he doesn't want to be on Mount Rushmore. He wants his own mountain, right? He wants to be remembered for the ages. He is playing the long game. This is where this is not like, I guess I don't have a lot of appetite for explanations that are of the form, well, he's just narrow-minded, he just wants to play golf. No, he's trying to do something very, very big, and wants to be remembered evermore. He's playing a different kind of game, though. The typical game that presidents, again, liberal and conservative alike, play, modern presidents in particular, in the service of not just rallying public support in a moment, but securing their historical legacies, is to pass things that are big and important and that endure. This is about the constructive advancement of an agenda. They remade the administrative state. They're the ones who passed the big law that fill in the blank. And it could be liberal or conservative. That's not so much the story about what presidents are doing, right? They're the politics, what Trump is doing. That's the story of the way, again, I think about this. It's about exacerbating anger and disaffection on the one hand, as a way to secure political support, in the service of disruption, in the service of breaking stuff, in the service of, like, when I think about, if I were just to bet, where is he going to have the most success? Breaking the administrative state or deploying the administrative state to do this incredibly complicated project of deporting millions of people, which is, whether or not you like it or dislike it, just think about how hard that job would be to actually pull that off. That requires a whole lot of administrative capacity. And if I'm placing bets, I'm going to say he's going to have a lot more success in breaking stuff than he is in actually building the expertise, constructing the organizations, developing the procedures that would be required to actually deliver on that particular promise, that positive promise. Positive in the sense of, here's a thing that he might be able to say that I said I was going to do something really hard and I delivered on it. I don't mean positive as in you like it or dislike it, moral, amoral. I don't mean that, right? And so the project of presidents who are populous, who play to the ages, are ones of saying, man, I vanquished higher ed. I did that, right? And all of their corruption, all their DEI nonsense, all of their out of touch ridiculousness. I broke it. And carry that over into all kinds of other domains. That's how they deliver. And that can be accomplished unilaterally. That can be accomplished in the ways that Trump is advancing his agenda. And he, again, decidedly is. He's not narrow-minded in the sense of, it may be just about him, but in the same way that all presidents are, they care about their historical legacy. His pathway to securing that legacy is different, though, by reference to his populism.
So we have a number of questions of people wanting to further interrogate this idea of populism as this major driver and distinction. We have a question from Amber W. that asks, can you speak to the social bases of populism in the US? What's the same and what's different vis-a-vis other times in US history? Do changes in the modern presidency give space and energy to populist politics?
So the last book that Terry and I wrote was called President's Populism and the Crisis of Democracy, that tries to provide an account of how populism took hold in this country and how it relates to presidential power. And it was a story of government failure, of government ineffectiveness, of the government's routine inability to meaningfully attend to the anxieties and harms caused by long-standing forces of globalization and technological change and unchecked immigration to the United States, which unsettled the public broadly and had adverse effects for certain communities that the government failed to attend to. When there's that as a backdrop, the populists, think again about the populist rhetoric. What is it? It's about everything's broken. When do those kinds of claims resonate? They resonate in the aftermath of, or in the midst of, routine, long-standing failure. And so there it is. That's what Trump tapped into. Everything is broken, right? Everything is broken. And there are a set of communities that looked around and said, yeah, you know what? Everything is broken. And that provided a kind of currency, a political currency that allowed him to lay claim to power. And in some important ways, that's small d democratically enhancing because it provides a deep systemic critique to actual failure. To our mind, the argument that we make in the book is that there's a kind of bait and switch, though, because what the populace doesn't do is that once they secure power is roll up his sleeves and say, well, let's get to work on solving these things in ways that are constructive so that we actually have a government that can properly function. Again, they stoke the anger and they go around and take things that weren't working well and break them. And that's, again, that's what we're observing. That's what's playing out in real time now.
So building on the same question, Julia A asks whether there are potential risks of using populist appeals to undermine institutions when Trump relies on some of these institutions to consolidate his power. For example, the courts, media, especially conservative-aligned media, congressional Republicans, conservative organizations, the Republican Party. Are there fatal contradictions, or can Trump continue to employ these populist attacks on institutions as part of his political project?
Julia, whoever you are. I think that there are real dangers here. Like this stuff doesn't come for free. There are ways in which the court's coming forward and issuing a ruling that says that the president has absolute immunity from legal prosecution is a boon to the presidential power in that goes above and beyond what Trump might be able to claim for himself. And I wouldn't call that a dependence so much as it's like an upgrade. If you can get the adjoining branches of government to do that, that plays to your advantage. And so if what you're doing at every turn is delegitimizing, marginalizing, and antagonizing those branches of government, aren't you making your life difficult for for yourself? There's this other piece, though, which is the adjoining branches of government, for the most part, when it comes to the logic of unilateral action, which is what these politics of populism, that's what sort of the centerpiece of it. The way that they most often present themselves is as potential checks on executive authority. And what you want really is to get them out of the way. What you really want to do is, sure, to the extent that they present themselves, it would be great if they applaud and write into the legal code or into statute broad claims of presidential power. That would be great. But boy, there's this downside with lifting them up, which is they're more likely to come in and check you and make your life difficult. And so at the margin, I think the calculus is better to degrade them. I think when it comes to power, there's another kind of trade-off, though, that also plays out, which is how long can the populace get away with just setting stuff on fire? At what point does the populace actually have to deliver, right? To take an action that says, I told you I would clean house in ways that was that made sense. I was going to actually solve a problem. And if what you're doing is at every turn breaking stuff, it's all but impossible through just your unilateral powers to solve stuff. And there may be a political reckoning then as well. And how that plays out, I think, is something for us to watch. Have we come to the end?
Come to the end. I'm afraid we're just out of time. Please join me in thanking you.